10 years after the landmark Paris Agreement, a new UN report shows that countries' climate pledges fall far short of what's needed to avoid catastrophic warming. Oxfam says the richest and most polluting nations have betrayed those suffering most from climate impacts, including people in Africa who are already living with droughts, floods, and food insecurity. Joining us now from Kampala is Jackson Rukara, Oxfam's climate justice coordinator in Uganda. Jackson, good morning to you and thank you for making time.
Good morning.
Let's start with this new UN report in terms of what your immediate reaction is to the findings, especially as someone working on climate justice in Africa.
What I think what we have committed to say is that the commitments that have been submitted by the different parties to the UNFCCC still fall short of what was agreed in the previous Paris Agreement that would reduce by 2030 emissions by 0.5. But when you look at what is being submitted at the UNFCCC and the report, the synthesis report talking about emission reduction, we are still very far away below the targets that we want to achieve. And that's why Oxfam is calling on the UNFCCC and its leadership to ensure that there are robust agreements at the COP30 to tax the polluters. The developing countries that have polluted the world must be taxed. And they must be taxed in a way that is appropriate to support countries that are feeling the pinch of the climate crisis. So money generated from the taxes would do a lot to support adaptation in the countries that are vulnerable to the climate crisis, but also support mitigation measures world over. And so we are calling for strong actions, for strong deliberations, and for ambitious pledges from the developed countries to support emission reduction and meet the commitment of the Paris Agreement.
Who are some of the culprits? Oxfam says the richest and most polluting countries have betrayed those that are hardest hit by climate disasters. And what are you seeing in Uganda and the wider region that illustrates this inequality?
If, for example, in our country, implementation of adaptation and mitigation measures have become a challenge. Even addressing climate-induced losses and damage is still challenging to us as a country because there are no finances that can support these challenges, implementation of action that address the challenges. So we think that there is need for more robust funding that should be generated from the international community because Africa is not responsible. For example, Uganda is not responsible. We have tried to conserve our natural resources. And we want to think that we are not responsible for the challenge that we are facing today. It was caused somewhere, and those that caused this challenge must be responsible to finance loss and damage in our countries, to finance adaptation in agriculture, for example, in our countries, to finance other mitigation measures. Because Uganda as a country, for example, has committed to also contribute to emission reduction through measures that support forestation, for example, preservation of the existing forests, preservation of the existing wetlands. But we need resources to support the farmers to be able to do that. And these resources should be generated from those companies that actually participated in the pollution, from the countries that polluted the world, and therefore they should be able to pay.
The report shows that current national climate plans would only cut emissions by 10% by the year 2035, when science says that we need at least 60% and not this 10%. Why is global action still moving so slowly?
I think it's because of the denials that we see. Every time we go for the conference of parties, we are in the denials. For example, the recent pronouncements by Trump, that shows that we are still living in denial. Polluting countries are still living in denial. They don't still believe that climate change is real. And for me, I think that they're living in denial. So it's high time they accepted that the climate challenge is real and that it will impact on them as well. Because we see hurricanes affecting the people in America, for example. We've seen serious disasters in China. And so countries like China, countries like America should be able to take responsibility and put in finances that can be able to support emission reduction. But also being intentional to make sure that they have measures that are robust and that there are pledges that come from them that will support emission reduction as we pledged at the Paris conference.
So, how do we ensure that the financing gathered, albeit not enough at this stage, through the taxation of the biggest contributing countries to pollution, lands where it needs to create impactful and sustainable transitions?
We need to ensure effective accountability mechanisms. For example, we are going for COP30. We must hold countries accountable. We must hold the parties accountable. Everybody should be accountable. How much have you pledged? How much have you been able to put in? And how much of that money has been able to go to the countries that are most affected? At country level, we are also putting up measures of monitoring what comes in our countries in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation funds. And we want to see how much of these funds are reaching the communities. We are also holding ourselves accountable as countries that are affected by climate challenges. So accountability will be key, transparency will be key, that we pledge and meet our pledges, and that money that is pledged is able to reach the countries that are most affected. But even within the countries that are most affected, there are existing accounting mechanisms that are participatory, where people monitor what has come in and see that the money is reaching the most affected grassroots people.
For the poorer countries who hold little or no responsibility in cutting emissions as much as the richest countries, is there a sense that they can get away with a slower pace in implementing emission cutting efforts since they only contribute a small percentage to global gas emissions? Africa contributes only about 3%, majority of that, even 3%, I think it's 1%, accounting for Southern Africa because of ESCOM. Or is it stressed enough that even amongst these countries, especially in Africa, accelerating climate pledges is a problem for us all and it needs equal effort?
I think it's not a huge problem as per se, because we must know that the polluting countries made a mistake, and so Africa should not follow suit. We must be responsible in terms of countries in Africa that look to be most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We must preserve what we still have, but also in terms of our interventions, we're talking about just energy transition. I know that many countries in Africa are going into oil exploration, or they're already into oil exploration. But how do we become intentional and conscious that our exploration also provides opportunities for responsible buffer opportunities that will support our emission consumption? So we must be able to do that. We must be responsible as countries in Africa to make sure that we preserve, we conserve what we have. We shouldn't go in the wagon of the polluters because we don't want to reach there. But we must present ambitious asks to the polluting countries, especially as an African negotiating group. We need a common voice to speak to the challenges of our time. And that common position should be presented at the global space, especially at COP30, to say we demand for robust financing agreements, for robust grants and not debts, because we don't want again to increase the debt burden of the African countries that are already burdened. And so money should be released in terms of grants to support adaptation, to support mitigation, to support the protection of the already existing natural vegetation that we have in Africa. We must be proud that for us, we are still having these vegetations, and we must preserve them. We are talking about carbon markets. The carbon markets should actually not be deals that, again, are going to put African countries and global South countries in a problem. We are saying that carbon market mechanisms should be consultative with the countries that are most affected. In countries where we're working with smallholder farmers, We want to see carbon markets that are benefiting the farmers. Because my farmers in Uganda are, for example, integrating agroecology in their farming systems. So what are the benefits
Right.
that they can get from this intervention that
And,
they're
and
doing
you laid
in
out there in
locally?
terms of your expectations as Oxfam from the leaders, the world leaders at COP30 that's coming up in Brazil. And thanks again for your time, Jackson. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Jackson Rukara is Oxfam's Climate Justice Coordinator in Uganda. Republic Bus and Truck RBT Company